or it's where we were. Because it was up to date once, but things have changed. But rarely where we are. And that's one of the big problems. Usually it's either we write the docs as a specification, or we write the docs, well, it was a point in time. But how can we keep it where we are? And one problem is that usually when we design our software, like we have a plan. This will look like a beautiful. Everything is straight, everything goes according to plan. And usually, well, we end up something like this. We add and iterate because there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we develop software. We add small pieces, we iterate, we add stuff, which means things will change. So the agenda for today we'll talk about how we can explore things, how we can experiment, and a little bit in the end about how we can automate these things. So now we talk about explore. What I mean by that? Well, there's one thing when it comes to getting automated automation is that metadata is really important. And metadata is something we have like the source of truth. If we generate from something, we can keep that as a source of truth. And it's if you ever done web development, then metadata is the model that we bind against or we code against. And how we document is the view. We can have different views on these models. And what can be the source of? Well, your source code can be one source of truth. Your data can be a source of truth. Artifacts, your build artifacts, your tools you're using, APIs, registers where you store your package, things like that. So if you look like things like your source code, well, the code itself can contain a lot of metadata, especially if you use something like that. There's a lot of things there, but also things like comments. We can have things like project files, which we have loads of information about both dependencies, what frameworks we're targeting, things that can be really important to document. We have things like package manifest and log files, which will contain more information about the dependencies than usually our project files does. You have your CI/CD templates that will be the source of truth of how your environment is built or set up with your cloud resource templates. Also, like your data can be a good source of truth. You have schema in some databases, which can provide you a lot of information about how things look now. You have relations between things. You have what users do we have can be interesting to document, permissions, and the data itself. And we'll look at something like DevOps artifacts. Well, it can be what's archived after a build can contain information we can find. The infrastructure as code is the source of truth of what's generated. You can have things like deploy scripts, npm packages, NuGet packages, and so on. Database packages, I mean that. And we look at tools. Well, many services has CLIs today. So you can use several tools that you can use to find, like the GitHub CLI can be good for finding out things about your developer environment that you want to document, like where are my branches, where are my repositories, what repositories do we have? The Azure CLI can be a good tool to be able to just poke around and see what you have. We have the .NET CLI if you're there, or you have other developer CLIs. You have the Azure DevOps CLI, just like the GitHub CLI. And we have things like we can script, PowerShell can run things on our machines, things like that. There are also several APIs, like if you're using GitHub, they have all repositories in GitHub has an atom feed, which you can use as an API. Just as a developer, you can use the app and see what releases there are, what branches there are. They have several APIs. They also have a GraphQL API where you can do things like query with more dynamic queries. The whole things like Azure, everything is built out the RM, the Azure Resource Manager, which is just a REST API. Essentially what your cloud templates compiled down to is a call to a REST API. But you can also use this API to inspect your environment. Also, things like Azure DevOps Services has loads of APIs because that's how their portal is built. And those are exposed to you. Also, a good source of truth are your registries. You have things like container registries, where you store your Docker containers, you store your bicep modules. There can be loads of information we can fetch at what exists in our organization. There's npm for a new API for your JavaScript things. There's NuGet for .NET. And here's like my key experiment. Like, don't be afraid to peek inside of things. For like looking at source codes, where are things? Can I find things that matter to me? It could be things like just like a folder structure can be important to document for developers, or there can be your data. What data do I have? What tables do I have? Don't be afraid to just go in and an enterprise manager, if you're in SQL, check what I have. Be curious. Same for artifacts. Check what build artifacts we have. Check what tools you're using in organization. Be curious is important. And APIs and registries. So how we can like start with this? Well, there's a good saying in general development, Yagni, you ain't gonna need it. And that's comes even more with documentation because it doesn't need to be beautiful. You can start small. Improve based on what your team needs. And then improve based on feedback. And enjoy. And how would that do in practice? Well, start with a hacky script. Just type something, get something to work, get something out, improve that script over time, iterate over it. Then, like, oh, this is starting to get complex. Well, maybe it should be a tool instead, or we can do some React template or server side or whatever, but that can be next best. And then it can be like, this is really good. I can share this. Go an open source project and have others contribute, because there's probably one more person that will document that service or that API or whatever. And then you can collaborate and things can improve on a larger scale and things will go on. So that's generally like what I would do. So let's go through some practical examples. So I think one example is if you look at something like a SQL server, there will be a lot of, like, you have your database, you have your tables, you have your views, and everything like that. And well, how would I, in a scenario like, how would I find the model or the metadata for this? And if we start just look with the script, batch, you can start iterate like, oh, let's start with script. And there's a module if you use PowerShell that's called SQL Server, which adds a command called invoke SQL command. I got a new laptop and its keyboard mess out for me, so but we will get through this together. So it will let you connect. So we'll connect to a server. We will have our login. It's just localhost, so you won't hack it anyways, but that's password. And database. As I'm rolling out a container, I will trust the certificate. And hopefully we can run a query now. So let's see. Cool. So one good thing about SQL is that everything has a schema. So let's do that. Then we can do things like select name. And we can see all the tables in that. We also want, like, well, what schema does this as well? If we go all, you can see there's loads of things. So, but there's loads of data. But let's start with the name, because we're going to start with what we need, and we want to know the schema. There's a schema ID. That's not very helpful, so you can either join or just use the schema name. And we have both the schema and things. And that means, but well, now we have some data we can iterate over. So let's do it. Now we can do things like, well, my preferred way to document is text files. I'm weird aware, but the good thing is like Markdown. Markdown is something that you can use with most static site generators. You can use it like with if you're running Azure DevOps Wiki, GitHub Wiki, or something like Jekyll, or I prefer static, or there are things, a lot of Hugo is another. So let's create some Markdown. I mean, it doesn't need to be pretty because the important part is output. So let's start with, well, we want table names. So let's go to schema. And then we will go with table name. And here you can use, like, you could dominate this in SQL query, any language you're comfortable, if it's JavaScript or Node or whatever, but the concept. So now we got Markdown for all our tables in our database. Wouldn't it be nice if we can also have the columns? So let's start with that. Single is quote. And let's add some columns. We can steal this part. And conveniently, it's called sys.columns in a SQL. In Oracle, it's a different name, but all these essential old SQL labels have. And the problem is, like, we will get from all. Let's see. Where did I go? Oh. Mm-hmm. This works. Let me copy this. We iterate live here. Let's see where we went from. Oh. Yeah. Good call. Copy paste too much. So that was there. So let's go name. That. Well, now we got too many columns. We need to filter, and each table has an object ID, so we'll need to add that. So that's the where. Need to pass that, create some variables. In PowerShell, you can do like a hash table. Let's do this. I want table. Table And we want to select that. So let's go. And we paste here. Oh. Let's go with the right syntax. If we can spell. So. And then we also get the columns and start that way. And now we can say, well, we want a nice, this will get messy, but essentially you can output that and do the list. But so let's output to a file. And if you use something like, you can essentially do markdown preview. But also, if you hack a little more, for like on a train ride or something, you can do, well, let's do something like this. Now we get some more, and that's a little more script with a little more things, so they do it. And then when we iterate a little bit more, let's see here, if we say we made a console application. We could make it even more pretty, because we add iteratively more things, because there are loads of metadata we find here, like what types are there, the default values, and you don't have to, like, all this code will be available, link it, you can just steal and play around with it. But essentially, like, you iterate over it. And you can start, like, on your coffee break, oh, I will just get the tables out. And you can show the stakeholders, these are the tables, these are the schemas we have. Then you can say, like, well, we'll need to improve it. And then you can add things and add things on. And that's like one sample if you look at something like SQL Server. There's also things like, if you look at Azure, you have the Azure CLI, which, if I want to list the web apps, I can just do web app, and I get JSON, which I can use as the model to start with that. Or you could go like me, like, well, I want a tool for it, so I wrote a tool that I will just let me do .NET ARI for Azure Resource Inventory. It will go to a tenant, and it will, with my current, go through all. And what happened there? Well, if we look, it generates loads of markdown files. What could be this? Well, combine it with something like a static site generator. And my process here was, I started with Azure CLI. Oh, nice, I can look at it. And then it was too slow and things like that. But this means that how long would it take to inventory all your Azure resources if you're a new consultant? Or would it take this long? We're already done one talking. So let's see an example. Yeah. So this is a tool, an open source tree tool you can use if you want, but similar that it went through all your resources. It grouped one view by tags, which is really important, like with your Azure resources. It did one view per subscription, so you can go down here and see, in the developer here, oh, we have all these resources. We can go in on the web, and then we can see extra. And when I did this tool, I started first with the common things. So just the names and IDs, and then went a little bit crazy, like, oh, we want the SKUs, the tags, and maybe we want things like, if we go to a website, we also get settings, the default code page, all this inventory in one place. There's also one good things about text files. You can commit them to your source repository too, and you can version them. So you have both documentation and auditing in one place. So, and one advantage as well, like when you're in Markdown files, is it's easy to distribute. You can have a static web app where you publish this to, and you can have it behind something like Enter ID, authentications, etc. So let's go to next. If you go like something like infrastructure as code, we have our bicep modules. And one interesting part there is that if you have something like registries, so how do I document that? Well, actually, a container registry is just a JSON API. Each layer you can get via API. And a bicep module in Azure is just an ARM template. So when you publish a bicep module, it will be a JSON file. And you as developers know how to open a JSON file and parse it. So then you can do things like, well, how would my registry look like? So I wrote a small tool called BRI, but anyone can that essentially goes through a container registry, goes through the 10 last tags for each repository, and creates in the same way Markdown files. And so if we preview that, in the time it takes to grab a coffee, we have a registry or our bicep module. So if I want, like, what are our database modules? And that's just convention-based. So in this way, like, we have chosen to convention-based by if it's a / it's a folder, but it's still just a repository in a registry. But means if you do conventions, you can also automate things. It can be either by getting things together with a tag, because you can have tag both in GitHub and Azure repos and others, but you can also get things just like you can see in our docs with Azure. Like I can go to the developer environment, or I can go others. But I can go things like, well, if you have an open source tool, like, so people can contribute, and you can see, like, if I go to this module, I can see the name, I can have all the parameters, because that's available as metadata on the projects. So you can see what are the default values. That's really valuable to see for your modules. But also, you can have things like what are the output parameters, which actually the Azure Docs doesn't even have for their modules. And I can find it quite useful to see what are the output, but even things like example code. And this is made by, like, if you see in Bicep, this is metadata which is available in that JSON ARM manifest. Things like description parameters, what are the minimum lengths, that's just built into the language. So you can actually, in the source code, find out things that will give you things to document. And if someone adds a parameter, it will just be available. You just run the script, and you can run it. Yeah. So that's really a powerful way to document things like from registries. If you look at NuGet packages, it's a zip file with available on HTTP endpoint with an XML file in it. And XML files we can parse. So there's other things like that for a registry. Let's see. Let's go over to some code in .NET. So if we look, same in .NET, there's several. Microsoft has a tool called DocFX you can use to document your source code. I will show it an open source project called Static Docs. So it's the same kind of premise. Like Static Docs is essentially you can create a console application that will give you a static site generator that you can use yourself. So if you want the static site generator, static is the framework, so you can create a simple .NET console application and do things like that. So let's see what we get out of the box. So the sample product we have here is a simple .NET library. You have an interface with nothing fancy. Just a method. You have a class or record, but that takes that in its constructor, and it has one method. And what do we get by default? We can get loads of things. We can get all the namespaces in our assembly. If we go down, we get our classes, our interfaces. We can get the things like inheritance hierarchy, so you can see what inherits from what without doing anything. But there are times when we want to sprinkle some editorial content. A great example can be if you have a property called timeout. What's the default value? Or is it timeout seconds? Like you should use something more basic, but just what are the default? Like a classic example is the SQL Server timeout is 30 seconds by default, but if you don't know that, it should be documented. So how can we like sprinkle some editorial content? Well, .NET has had since essentially 1.0. So it's been like, there's a 20-year-old technology that some .NET developers don't know about called XML-doc that's built into the IDE. And we can just do things like a triple slash, and it will add some XML comments above your code. And then we can have, this is the hello method. This is the name parameter. We can go more descriptive. Logs, line, log, message. You know it's a developer. If we regenerate, let's see. Forgot to stop it before. Can add some comments on. It's the logger interface. Obviously. All that's done. So let's build a preview. So if we go down here, we will see that we got some editorial content. The logger interface, but it can be something describing something more. And we can also have things like with the parameters. So we get a lot for free. We also get, let's see if I go to REST method. There. We can do more, like the timeout is the default, but we can also do sample code. So there's also like a code block that's built in that you do, and then we'll add sample code, and that's built into the XML-doc standard. I've been there for a while. And static docs is one tool there, and docfx is the one that Microsoft uses for docs, .microsoft.com. So it's some really good tools for that. Let's see. But the good thing about having something like a static website is that you can actually do multiple sources for documentation. So wouldn't it be nice if I could like get all the dependencies of my .NET project also in the docs? So let's see if we can try to add that. We can keep it running. I think it's helpful. So let's do. I will do it like this. So I like small tools. I created a tool called DPI, which is dependency injection, and it's easy to inspection. Usually it will report to a log analytics server, but it can also create a markdown file. And it will look through essentially all the CS prod files you have, all the project manifests. So if you have done a .NET Restore or something, it will look through those. It will also look for your tools JSON. If you have any cake files for build scripts or things like that, it will look for those and find any .NET dependencies. and it detected, that's part of static framework, it detected probably hot reload. And if we go now, we have a tab called dependencies, and a nice tab here where we get this project has all these dependencies. And that's far quicker than when you have done it by hand, I think. You could go through the XML file and then someone adds something and like I have to redo it. It's more like a Sisyphus thing. Like someone adds something and this you can think it at all. You get all that for free. And I mean, start simple. Start with I get this, and then you can iterate over it. There's also other tools. There's loads of SBOM tools like bill of materials that you can use that can actually generate reports in HTML, Markdown, or other things you can use. So let's go. So automate. Well, there's like 2 ways to be mean to your future self or your colleagues. It's lie. You can lie in documentation and say like, this is how it works. No, it's not. That's one way to be mean. Or stop updating. It will generate like both is the same. If you stop updating documentation, like this was especially like if you ship often as we do in DevOps scenario, if we're like, we thought the database looks like this. No, it doesn't. So, like, if something is hard and it causes friction, I think the way you should do it often. It's like if you're training physical, like if I'll go mountain biking, it's hard, and I will try, and I get better at it. But in IT, a good way to do something often is to automate it, because it will do it like. It will be happy. It will do the same thing every time, and it won't ask for anything or like, I'm on a cron job. I will do it every time. And it will do the same thing every time, which is also like, it won't take shortcuts. I also saw a good talk yesterday, like with how our brains work. We take shortcuts all the time. The script, you won't. And when automating documentation, I worked like with a couple of models. The most common ones are either it's part of the build pipeline. It could be that the DPI thing we saw, that's an artifact that comes with, because your dependencies will be the same for it. When you build, they won't change. So that can be, there's an artifact, a part of your build. It can also be something like the ARI or BRI, where you inspect your environment. So you run something like the Azure CLI or something, and you look at the source of truth. That's nothing closer to the source of truth than that, because even if someone done something manual in a portal, you will still find that thing. That's why it's also good for auditing. Or if you're like me, a new consultant in the company, I can quickly see what resources do I have access to, what do they have. Oh, that machine should be shut down. It hasn't been, because obviously when we migrated, we shut down everything. Well, I often find we don't. And also can be part of the documentation pipeline. I have customers where we run, like every night we run the documentation pipeline and it does the work there. And how can, often a combination of the above, how can it look? So part of the build pipeline is usually like, we build our .NET project, we build our node modules, we build something. And then we build our docs when we have restored. One part of it is important, we don't have like, to know the full dependency graph of a .NET project, you need to restore first because it will change. And then we upload one artifact for our software, but also an artifact for our documentation. And then we have our documentation pipeline pick that artifact up, and it will generate the docs either to something that's if just push to a wiki. If you look at something like both GitHub wikis and Azure pipeline, DevOps wikis, it's a Git repository you can push to essentially. So you could just do something like that. Or you can do something like I did here with a static site generator and push it to something like static web apps, or push it to just an app service or GitHub pages or something like that. Inspect a separate pipeline, essentially have a cron job that inspects, build the docs, have an artifact, and then you pick it up by your pipeline. And if you have something that's part, essentially then you do, well, have a long YAML file or build script or whatever that does, it will inspect, it even can compile the code, but because it could be that you don't have access to something. But I prefer to have something that isn't part of the docs pipeline, because then the docs pipeline doesn't need access to your environment. You can have something else that has that access, and you just pip down the artifact. But one really important thing with documentation is the audience. Who's going to read this documentation? Because is it operations, then they need one view, like what are the resource names, how are they, like what environments do we have, and things like that. That might be what's important for them. If you look at something like developers, well, they want to know what NuGet packages they are. Also operations might want to know what bicep modules, but that's also something that the developers want to know. So it could be that you have two views of the same data. But it can also be they want the code comments and things like that. So that's one audience. We also have the business. They want to know where the website is. Then don't know how it works, but they want to know the URI for it. So they want, like, how do I get to the staging to test my code? That's documentable. So they can have a smaller view. And that's easy to do if you have the same kind of data, just as we do with other things. You do it tailored for each. And also public. If you do public documentation, you don't want internal subscription IDs, you don't want things that can leak out. You might want to document to, if you're a vendor, that this solution is set up of one Azure service, one storage account, and one SQL server. That might be the documentation that you can keep up to date and just have that view on the data. But it's very important so you don't leak anything, so everyone can Google your internal subscription IDs or something like that. So think about the audience. And that's why I mean it's really important to keep the Yagni in mind. Start with just what you need. It's so easy for us developers to be, many properties. I can document them all. But it can also be that you inadvertently leak something that you shouldn't. Start small and iterate based on need. So my summary for this is be curious. Look into your environment. Care about your environment. It's like, see what do we have. Don't be afraid to crack that NuGet package up. A really good example is like if you go to nuget.org, and if you look at any package, there's probably some popular. There's actually now something called the NuGet Package Explorer. And you can actually crank up any NuGet package without even downloading it. And this is actually an UWP application running in the browser via Westman. There you know. And this is actually a good safety practice. Before you take a dependency, look in it. But here you can see things like, here we have, and this is metadata. We can see that this NuGet assembly targets these target frameworks. This is actually a folder structure we can use for our documentation. But it's also, as I said, a package manifest is just an XML file which contains the sampling. And as I said, start small and automate and find what makes sense to you. Like for some, it's good enough to have, and it's probably better than you have today to have something that runs every night and have a documentation up to date. And also iterate. Do it more often and find in all things. And if you can collaborate on that tool, like, it could be, the advantage with an open source tool is that you can go cross companies. You don't need to, it's not core business to document your Azure resources. So it's something you can learn and trade off. But it can also be that you have something that's very special for you. So it's important to find what works for your team. If a new developer starts, what are the questions they ask? Can we get that into the documentation and can we have it up to date? So, thank you.